Have you ever stood in the middle of your life and felt like the ground beneath you had disappeared? One day, everything seems familiar. Your morning coffee tastes the same, the faces around you wear predictable expressions, and the path ahead feels steady, even if it's not perfect. And then, without warning, something shifts. A phone call in the middle of the night, a company-wide email, a diagnosis from a doctor, a sudden goodbye. It doesn't have to be dramatic to be devastating. Even the smallest ripple in your routine can feel like a storm when you weren't ready for it. That's the strange thing about life. It rarely asks for your permission before it changes. And yet, we all cling. We cling to plans, to titles, to people, to moments, as if holding on tightly enough could stop the inevitable. But it never does. The storm comes anyway. Not always in howling winds or crashing waves. Sometimes it's quiet. A subtle unease in your chest. A restless night's sleep. A growing sense that the things you once trusted no longer feel quite the same. Change is relentless. It's in the seasons shifting outside your window, in the faces of old friends, in the reflection you catch in the mirror. It moves with or without your consent. And if you're like most people, you've spent much of your life trying to outpace it, to avoid its reach, to pretend it won't arrive at your doorstep. But here's a truth rarely spoken out loud. It's not change itself that overwhelms us. It's our resistance to it. The human mind was designed for survival. For thousands of years, it's kept us safe by seeking the familiar, by avoiding the unknown, by desperately clinging to whatever felt predictable. In the wild, that instinct meant life or death. Today, it means we suffer every time reality refuses to match our expectations. And let's be honest, it almost never does. The ancient Buddhist masters understood this long before neuroscience gave it a name. They spoke of a simple but profound principle, anicca, impermanence. Everything that arises passes away. The flowers bloom and wither. The sun rises and sets. Joy visits and departs. Sorrow arrives and eventually leaves too. It's not a punishment. It's the very nature of existence. Yet, how often do we forget this? We plan as though life owes us a certain outcome. We attach as though people will stay forever. We grieve not just the loss itself, but the illusion we held that what we loved could last. It's no wonder the storms inside us feel so fierce. And maybe that's why, in moments of upheaval, a simple, ancient question matters more than ever. Is it possible to find peace not after the storm has passed, but while it's still raging? To live in a world where things fall apart and yet keep a steady heart. To watch the leaves fall and still trust in the tree. To lose, to mourn, to stumble, and somehow to remain whole. That isn't naive optimism. It's wisdom. And it isn't reserved for monks on distant mountain tops or philosophers lost in dusty books. It's available to you, right here, right now. The path begins not with denial, not with desperate control, but with seeing clearly. To look directly into the shifting nature of your life and not turn away. To witness how your heart tightens at the thought of endings, how your mind scrambles for certainty, how your breath shortens when faced with the unknown. Because awareness is the first mercy. When you name what hurts, when you see the storm for what it is, an inevitable, unstoppable, sometimes beautiful force, you stop wasting energy pretending it isn't there. And something curious happens. A small, steady space opens up inside you. A quiet spot untouched by the chaos. Not because the storm is over, but because you are no longer entirely consumed by it. The Buddhists called this space equanimity, a calm center that remains even when the world tilts on its axis. And it's not born from ignoring your pain or dismissing your fear. It's built by walking straight into them, carrying the lantern of awareness in one hand and the gentle touch of compassion in the other. This is the work, not to avoid change but to ride its waves, to love what you can while it's here and to let it go when it must leave. To trust that, like every storm, it too will pass and so will you. And if you can begin, just begin, to see the patterns of impermanence not as threats but as the pulse of life itself. Well then, even in the heart of the storm, peace is no longer an impossibility. It's a choice. And that choice belongs to you. Somewhere in the folds of a quiet morning, you glance out your window and notice a single leaf drifting down from an old tree. At first, it seems insignificant, a moment too small to matter. But if you pause, really pause, you realize it carries a quiet truth the world has been whispering to you all along. Nothing lasts. The laughter of a child, the sting of a harsh word, the warmth of a lover's touch, the ache of an old wound. Everything without exception rises and falls, appears and fades, begins and ends. This isn't just philosophy. It's the very structure of existence. Look closely at your own life. The home you grew up in no longer smells the same. The friendships you swore would never change have shifted like the tide. The dreams you held at 20 may no longer fit the shape of your heart at 40. And yet, we resist. We build our lives as though permanence were promised. We fall in love as though forever were guaranteed. We mourn losses not only because something precious is gone, but because somewhere deep down we believed it would always be there. This, the Buddha taught, is the root of our suffering. Not change itself, but our refusal to accept it. In ancient times, beneath the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha Gautama sat not seeking to escape the world, but to understand it. And what he saw was not a cruel universe, but a beautifully dynamic one. A world in constant motion. A life where birth, death, joy, pain, gain, and loss endlessly weave together like threads in a vast, intricate tapestry. He called this law anicca, impermanence, not as a theory but as an unshakable truth. Everything conditioned, everything born of causes, everything formed is destined to dissolve. The seasons taught him. The human body confirmed it. The mind's fleeting thoughts made it undeniable. Modern science, thousands of years later, would echo this wisdom in its own language. Atoms forever in motion. Cells constantly dying and renewing. Mountains rising and eroding. Stars collapsing and being born. And still we cling. We grasp at youth as though age weren't inevitable. We chase security as though the future can be controlled. We hoard, we attach, we declare, this is mine, this is me, this will last. And in every grasp, we plant the seeds of our own grief. But here's the most merciful irony. Within the truth of impermanence lies not despair, but profound liberation. If nothing lasts, then no sorrow is eternal. If nothing is fixed, then you are never trapped by your current circumstances. If every moment is new, then every breath carries the chance for renewal. The Buddhists likened it to watching clouds move across the sky. You don't try to hold a cloud. You don't grieve its passing. You simply watch it shift, appreciating its shape while it's there, trusting it will drift away when its time comes. Your thoughts are like this. So are your emotions. So is your fear. And so is your joy. To live with wisdom is to move with this rhythm, not against it. To bow to what arrives, to bless what leaves, and to stand in the river of life without needing to dam its flow. Imagine if you could hold your life this way. Not gripping it tightly like sand, but cradling it gently, knowing each grain will eventually slip through your fingers, and that this is not a tragedy, but the natural order. It doesn't mean you care less. It means you care better. You love with open hands. You work without the weight of endless outcomes. You forgive not because you forget, but because you recognize clinging to pain is like trying to chain the wind. This is what impermanence asks of us. Not to become cold or indifferent, but to live fully in each moment precisely because it will not come again. The taste of this morning's tea, the face of your aging father, the ache of a parting goodbye, the thrill of a new beginning. Each one passing, each one precious. And when you see life this way, the storms feel less cruel. You stop asking why the seasons must change and start learning how to dance in the rain. Because impermanence, when embraced, becomes not a curse but a teacher. It reminds you to say what matters now, to forgive while you still can, to laugh loudly, to love deeply, to grieve fully, knowing it all belongs to the same beautiful, vanishing moment we call life. And in that understanding, peace isn't found after things settle. It's discovered right here, in the shifting, fleeting, impossible to grasp now. There's a story in ancient Buddhist tradition about a wise monk who once stood before a group of restless villagers. They came to him, faces tense, hearts heavy, desperate for answers to the storms life had thrown their way. One man shouted, "My son has fallen ill. What should I do?" Another cried, "My crops have failed. How can I bear it?" A woman, voice trembling, whispered, "My beloved is gone. I don't know how to keep living." The monk listened to each with gentle eyes, and when they'd spoken, he said just one thing, "This too will pass." At first they were bewildered, even angry. How could such a simple phrase ease the weight of their grief, their fear, their loss? But in time, as seasons turned and wounds began to soften, those words became a quiet lantern in the dark. Because life, in its relentless unfolding, will always rise and fall. And peace, true, steady peace, isn't found by controlling the waves. It's found in learning how to float. This is equanimity, a word often spoken but rarely understood. Not numbness, not indifference, but a calm, centered awareness that allows you to witness life's highs and lows without being shattered by either. In Buddhist philosophy, equanimity is called upekkha, a deep, unwavering stillness of heart, unshaken by praise or blame, gain or loss, pleasure or pain. Imagine standing in the eye of a storm. Around you, winds howl, debris flies, trees bend and break. But where you stand, it's quiet, clear, still. That is the art of inner balance, and it isn't born from escaping the world's hardships. It's born from understanding them. The mind, by its nature, clings to what it loves and recoils from what it fears. It chases the pleasant, flees the painful, and in doing so, it exhausts itself, forever caught between longing and aversion. Equanimity asks a different question. What if you could allow things to be as they are, without needing them to be different? What if you could watch joy arrive without clinging to it, and watch sorrow visit without collapsing beneath it? It sounds impossible at first, but the truth is, we've all tasted it in fleeting moments. That breath you took between tears, when the world paused for a second and you realized you were still here. That sudden clarity in the middle of chaos, when you knew somehow you would endure. That sunset you watched, knowing tomorrow would bring new worries, and still, for that moment, you let yourself simply be. Equanimity isn't the absence of feeling. It's the spaciousness to hold both joy and grief in the same open palm, knowing neither defines you. It's the wisdom to say, this is beautiful and it will pass. This is painful and it will pass. And in that knowing, a lightness enters the heart. Great teachers remind us, the world will praise you one day and condemn you the next. Fortune will favor you one season and abandon you the next. People you cherish will appear, stay, and inevitably leave. This isn't cynicism, it's tenderness. Because when you stop fighting the nature of life, you stop wasting your strength on impossible battles. You learn to invest your energy where it matters, in kindness, in clarity, in presence. Equanimity grants you the power to meet suffering without drowning in it, to savor happiness without grasping at it, to stay steady when everything around you tilts and sways. It's not a talent you're born with, it's a practice, a daily remembering. Each time you pause before reacting, each time you breathe through discomfort, each time you soften your grip on certainty. Little by little, the storms still come, but you're no longer at their mercy. You begin to recognize the passing clouds for what they are, movements in the vast sky of your awareness. The ancients called it the unshaken mind, like a mountain unmoved by the winds. And while you may never reach perfect stillness, every step toward it frees you a little more. The moments that once shattered you begin to lose their power. The applause and criticism no longer dictate your worth. You become a steady flame in the shifting night. And the world, in all its impermanence, becomes not something to fear, but something to love more deeply because of its fleeting nature. So tonight, or perhaps this very hour when change knocks at your door again, as it always does, you'll meet it differently. Not with clenched fists, not with denial, but with open eyes and an open heart. And in that space, peace lives. There's a moment that comes, often quietly, after the storm of emotions has settled. After you've tasted the sharp edge of loss, the dizzying sweetness of success, the gnawing ache of uncertainty. It's a strange kind of clarity, a pause, a stillness beneath the noise. And in that space, something remarkable can happen. You begin to see not what you wish things were, not what you fear they might become, but what they truly are. This is the heart of mindfulness. And more than just a trendy word on wellness apps, mindfulness is an ancient, profound practice taught by the Buddha himself. A way of being awake to your life as it unfolds, moment by precious moment, not lost in memory, not tangled in fantasy, not buried under anxieties of tomorrow, but here, fully, intimately, unflinchingly present. It begins simply with the breath, the quiet rise and fall in your chest, the cool air entering your nostrils, the warmth as it leaves. No need to alter it, no need to control, just witness it as it is. And then with practice, this awareness widens. You notice the subtle tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your jaw, the cascade of thoughts rushing by like clouds across a vast sky. You start to see how one word can spark a dozen reactions, how a memory can tighten your throat, how a passing worry can shrink your world. And slowly, with gentleness, not judgment, you begin to watch it all, like standing at the edge of a river, observing leaves floating past. This is mindfulness, but its deeper companion is insight. Because while mindfulness makes you aware of what's happening, insight reveals the nature of what you're seeing. It whispers truths beneath the surface. It shows you that the anger you clutch is made of fear, that the craving you chase is born of emptiness, that the thing you believed you couldn't live without was never truly yours to hold. Insight dissolves illusions. It turns what once felt solid into mist. And this matters because so much of our suffering isn't caused by life itself, but by the stories we attach to it. A thought appears, I am not enough. And we believe it. A person leaves, I will never be loved again. And we let it carve itself into our bones. Mindfulness teaches you to notice these thoughts. Insight teaches you not to be ruled by them. You begin to recognize patterns. The way your mind spins the same old tales, wearing different masks. The Buddha described it beautifully. Within this fathom-long body and mind is found the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the path leading to its cessation. Meaning, you don't have to travel to mountaintops or distant monasteries to discover the nature of existence. It's happening right here, in your breath, your grief, your laughter, your restless nights. Each sensation, each thought, each craving and sorrow is a doorway to wisdom, if you dare to look closely. But it requires courage, because seeing things as they are means accepting impermanence, acknowledging your own fragility, facing the reality that nothing, no pleasure, no possession, no identity can ultimately protect you from life's constant unfolding. Yet in this very acknowledgement, paradoxically, lies peace. The great masters knew this. They spoke of the suchness of things, that a rose is beautiful not because it will last, but because it blooms fully in its brief hour, that a storm isn't cruel nor kind, it simply is. And when you stop demanding the world conform to your desires, you stop suffering so deeply from its refusal. You begin to find beauty in the ordinary, wisdom in discomfort, companionship in your own solitude. Mindfulness isn't a technique, it's a way of living, a vow to be awake even when it hurts, to see the flicker of light in the darkness, to feel your own heart beating in a world you cannot control. And insight is what turns that awareness into freedom, not the kind sold by gurus or promised in flawless Instagram quotes, but the kind you earn quietly, moment by moment, breath by breath. When you notice the thought and choose not to follow, when you feel the ache and let it soften without escape, when you catch yourself mid-reaction and, for a heartbeat, simply observe. These small acts are revolutions. They change the shape of your mind, and in time, the shape of your world. Because the world, you'll discover, was never the problem. It was the way you held it. And now, perhaps for the first time, you're learning to open your hands. Once you begin to see things as they are, something unexpected happens. The walls you built to keep yourself safe, to shield your heart from pain, start to soften. You realize that every person you meet is carrying their own invisible weight. That behind the eyes of a stranger, a silent storm may rage. And in the mirror, the reflection you judged so harshly is simply a human being, longing to be at ease. This is where loving kindness begins, not as a duty, not as a virtue to wear like a badge, but as a natural unfolding of the awakened heart. In the ancient Pali language, it's called metta, unconditional goodwill, a wish for all beings, yourself included, to be happy, to be free from suffering. It sounds simple, but like the most essential things, it's profound. Imagine for a moment turning toward yourself, not with critique but with tenderness. Not fixing, not improving, just holding the fragile parts of your being as you would cradle a wounded bird. This isn't self-indulgence, it's wisdom. Because how can you offer peace to the world while waging war inside your own heart? The Buddha taught that loving kindness must begin with oneself. Just as a mother protects her only child at the risk of her own life, so should one cultivate a boundless heart toward all beings. And this love, this deep, abiding care, isn't a feeling you force. It's a practice. A discipline of softening again and again toward what you'd rather turn away from. You sit, you breathe, you silently repeat, "May I be well. May I be at peace. May I be free from suffering." And when the mind resists, as it inevitably will, you notice that too with kindness. Then you widen the circle. You offer those same wishes to a friend, to a difficult person, to the nameless millions you'll never meet, to all beings in every direction, not because you should, but because somewhere in the stillness you begin to remember we belong to each other. Your sorrow is not separate from mine. Your joy is not a threat, but a light I can share. And so the tight fist of the self slowly opens. Compassion, called karuna in the old texts, blooms naturally from this soil. It's not pity. It's not fixing others to ease your discomfort. It's the quiet courage to be present with suffering, yours and theirs, without flinching. To stay when it would be easier to turn away. To listen when words feel inadequate. To hold space for grief without rushing to erase it. And here's the paradox. In extending compassion to others, you heal yourself. Because the boundaries between self and other are thinner than you think. The mother comforting her child feels her own heart soften. The stranger offering a kind glance to someone lost in sorrow lifts a weight they didn't know they carried. And so, in times of change, when fear isolates and uncertainty builds walls, loving kindness and compassion become your lifelines. They remind you that no storm lasts forever, that no heart is too shattered to mend, that in the vast, unfathomable web of existence, every act of care ripples outward, unseen but enduring. You don't have to save the world. You don't have to fix what is broken. You only have to show up, with a heart willing to feel, a hand willing to reach out, a presence willing to remain. The old masters knew this. They spoke of the Bodhisattva, the one who vows to keep returning to this troubled world, not for personal liberation alone, but to ease the suffering of all beings. And while you may not wear their robes or chant their vows aloud, you carry the same seed, a capacity to love more fiercely, more gently than you believed possible. It starts small, a kind word when your instinct is sharpness, a silent blessing for the stranger who cuts you off in traffic, a whispered forgiveness to yourself for not having it all together. Each small act a candle against the dark, each moment of tenderness a thread stitching the world back together. And when your own heart feels empty, remember, loving kindness isn't something you must produce from thin air. It's the natural state of an unguarded heart. It returns if you let it, if you pause, if you breathe, if you remember that underneath the armor, you are not separate from the aching world you long to heal. And perhaps, in that remembering, peace will find its way back to you. There's a quiet truth that reveals itself in the stillness, A truth we often resist, but one that holds the key to our deepest freedom. You are not who you think you are. The self, this image you carry of me and mine, this story stitched together from memories, fears, and hopes, is not a fixed thing. It's a momentary arrangement like clouds forming shapes in a passing sky. And yet we cling to it, desperately, grasping for control over things we never truly held. We try to command the tides of change, to dictate who stays and who leaves, to make the world conform to the narrative we've written in our minds. But life, as it always does, refuses to obey. The Buddha called this illusion anatta, non-self, not as a denial of your lived experience, but as an invitation to see more clearly. You are not a static entity moving through an unchanging world. You are a process, a flux, a collection of elements, body, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness, arising and fading moment by moment. And the more you cling to a fixed identity, the more you suffer, because change isn't an interruption. It's the nature of everything. The ancient masters taught that when you realize this, something inside you loosens. You stop fighting the river and let yourself be carried. It's not passivity, it's wisdom. The wisdom to see that control was never the point, that safety was never guaranteed, that in trying to armor yourself against life's uncertainty, you miss the beauty of what is alive, here, now. But there's something even more radical the Buddha pointed to, the truth of interbeing. Thich Nhat Hanh, the gentle Zen master, used this word to describe the reality that nothing exists independently. Not a flower, not a cloud, not a thought, not a human being. A single sheet of paper carries within it the sun, the rain, the logger's hands, the soil, the tree, the air. Without those, there would be no page to write these words upon. And so it is with you. Your breath is borrowed from the forests. Your heartbeat echoes the rhythms of countless ancestors. Your joy and sorrow ripple through lives you'll never know. You are not alone, and you never were. When you see this, the illusion of separation between self and other, between what you can control and what you can't, begins to dissolve. You no longer have to carry the unbearable weight of making everything okay. You don't have to fix the storm or outsmart the winds of fate. You only have to belong to this moment, to respond with tenderness where you can, and to let go where you cannot. This is what the old teachers meant when they spoke of freedom, not escape from life's unpredictability, but release from the grip of your own illusion. The storm still comes, loss still arrives at your doorstep, but you are no longer lost inside the endless struggle to hold what was never yours. Instead, you stand like a tree rooted deep in the earth, swaying with the wind but never breaking. You become vast, a presence that includes everything. The laughter, the grief, the hope, the loss. And from that vastness, compassion arises. Because when you no longer see yourself as separate, you no longer see others as strangers. Their pain is your pain. Their joy is your joy. And the barriers you spent a lifetime building begin to crumble. A line from the old Zen poems whispers, boundless as the sky, vast as the ocean. This mind is free. This is the heart of peace. Not in mastering the world, but in dissolving the illusion that you ever needed to. When you rest in this knowing, something extraordinary happens. Change no longer threatens you, because you no longer exist as a fixed point to be threatened. You become the sky itself, vast, open, untouched by passing storms. And in this sky-like mind, everything is welcome, everything belongs, everything passes. And you remain, not as a name, a title, a role, but as presence, as awareness itself. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's all you ever needed to be. And so here we are, not at the end of a story, but standing in a quiet clearing, within the very heart of it. The storms of life haven't disappeared. The winds of change still sweep across the horizon. The world still spins with all its uncertainty, its beauty, its ache. But you are different now, because something within you remembers. That peace was never out there. It was never waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect outcome, the world finally aligning itself to your expectations. It was here all along, in this breath, in this fleeting, ordinary, sacred moment, change will come, and sometimes it will break your heart. People you love will leave, plans will shatter, certainties will vanish like mist at dawn. And yet, you will remain, not because you've armored yourself against the world, but because you've learned to let it move through you, because you've discovered the quiet art of choosing peace moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat. The wisdom of impermanence has shown you that nothing lasts. The practice of equanimity has taught you to steady your heart in the midst of the wave. Mindfulness has sharpened your vision, revealing things as they truly are. And loving kindness has opened your heart, even when it ached to close. You've seen the illusion of control unravel before you, and in its place, you've touched the vastness of connection, the silent truth that you are not alone, and never were. And now, you stand with the same world before you, but with new eyes. You don't have to chase peace. You don't have to wait for a quieter season. You don't have to earn calm through perfection. You can choose it, here, now, in this breath. In this small, quiet moment between all the moments, peace is a decision, a practice, a returning, not to some perfect version of yourself, but to the ground beneath your feet, the sky above your head, the steady beat of your own heart. It's in the way you speak to yourself when you stumble, the tenderness you offer a stranger, the pause before reacting, the breath you reclaim when the world demands you hurry. It's in the silent knowing that while you cannot stop the storm, you are no longer lost inside it. You are the witness, the presence, the calm in the very heart of the whirlwind. And this is your practice, not to escape life, but to live it fully, with courage, with softness, with eyes open to the miracle and the ache, to meet each change, each ending, each beginning, not with fear, but with a steady, open-hearted yes. So as you step back into your life, with its unpredictable turns, its quiet joys, its inevitable losses, carry this truth with you. Peace is always available, always waiting in the still point beneath the noise, always yours to choose, and every moment is another chance to come home to it. Thank you for walking this path, for remembering what was always yours. Be well, be kind, and when the storm comes, as it will, be the calm,